I presume that everyone has read Dr. Ahluwalia's wonderful report, the report brought out by the High Power Committee. So a lot of my presentation is based on that assumption. So in case some of you have not read it, please bear with me. I can clarify certain issues on our behalf in case there is a need. But I've basically worked on the various recommendations that have come out of this wonderful report. I need to talk today on the long-term financing needs of urban local bodies, particularly with reference to the small and medium cities. At the same time, I also would like to share with you some of the experience that we've had in Tamil Nadu, especially the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund, of which I was fortunate to be the CEO for over 2 years. Just the context, and this was all published partly from the ministry's own documents as well as from the High Power Committee report. As you would all know, when the JNNURM started in 2005-06 for 7 years, the outlay was initially 1 lakh, later on got increased to 1,20,000 crores, and till 2010, according to their website, the total sanctions is about 1 lakh crores. And as you all know, JNNURM has certain components. The component devoted to the small and medium towns is called UIDSSMT, which covers the non-mission 65 cities. And again, according to the ministry's own documents, nearly 1,000 projects, actually 900 something projects, worth about 20,000 crores have been approved in last year. And whereas the actual releases, and I'm taking that as actual investment, is about 7,000 crore. And if you just average it, it's about 1,500 crores on an average. So the issue is that this has so far been the investments that have actually happened thanks to the JNNURM on an average. And this not necessarily, this is only for the UIDSSMT cities. As you all know, the scheme actually provides for very liberal grants in the ratio of 80 from central government, 10 from state and 10 from local bodies, except the special states where even this 10 is taken care of by the central government. So typically the grants that flow to such projects are 90 to 100% of the project cost. The High Power Committee mentions that there are something like 1,600 municipalities and 2,100 Nagar Panchayats, which form the universe of the small and medium towns. In terms of investments, it's been assumed that out of the 39 lakh crore that is required for 20 years in the urban sector, if you were to take out the main cities, the metropolitan cities, I'm assuming that about 50% of this investment would be required for the small and medium towns, which works out to typically about a lakh crore per year, which if you see the amount of investment that's happened in the past 5 years or 6 years, since the JNNURM started, what we are talking of is investments every year at about 65 times the current investment rate. Just wanted to put this in the context that when we are talking, we're really talking of scale. 65 times the current investment with all the infrastructure that we have at our disposal. Of course, this is all well known to all of you. Don't want to spend too much time. So we all know that principally local bodies have their own sources of revenue as well as revenues from statutory transfers based on the Finance Commission recommendations as well as share in certain kind of taxes. And then there are specific grants in nature. So broadly, these are the sources of finance for local bodies. Thanks to this phenomenal growth that our economy has been seeing, with growth rates in the region of about 8% or so, and given traditionally that India has had a good savings rate, we believe there is a huge potential now to tap financial markets, retail investors, institutional investors, to actually drive municipal financing. However, if you just take the municipal debt market in India, over the past decade or so, and this is borne out by a report by Dr. Chetan Vaidya, totally about 1,200 crores or so has been mobilized till date, and this has principally been in 3 states, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka and Gujarat, and most of them by individual corporations and municipalities and some bit of pooled financing. Now at this point I would like to just take a digression and talk about the US municipal bond market so that we understand the context. While India has been able to mobilize just about 1,200 crores over all these years, what has been the US bond experience? And the gentleman who was sitting there had mentioned he wanted to have some idea about. Basically, if you see the historical perspective, the United States in the 80s had a situation where the environmental legislation was brought in, which mandated that all the local bodies needed to clean up their act physically and literally, which means under the Clean Water Act and this Drinking Water Act, it was mandated that local bodies, local governments as they call them in the United States, were mandated to clean up their water bodies and the water supply systems. However, as in the case of India, the United States also had a problem of having adequate funds to fund these kind of initiatives. But because there was a very strong environmental act and a lobby, so everyone wanted these projects to get off the ground but didn't have the dollars to do it. And hence, in response to that, what was evolved was what is called the state revolving funds, which were typically financial intermediaries. They also realized that, as in the case of India here, that the local bodies are local communities, very small levels of government who don't have the capacity to actually go to debt markets and raise finance. And therefore, there was a need to have a financial intermediary at the state level, which would be in the nature of revolving funds, who would raise capital from the markets on behalf of these bodies and then pass it on to them, use the revenues from these projects to actually repay the creditors. And therefore, the concept of pool financing was evolved, where it was believed that, and I'll come to a next slide which talks about the advantages of pooling. The idea was that the requirement of certain local bodies could be pooled, and then you could go to market to raise debt on their behalf. Their target was clearly the huge mutual funds, the pension and the insurance funds, who coincidentally had a need for long-term investment. Now, typically banks, as you know, normally raise funds on short term, typically 5 to 7 years, whereas these projects for water and wastewater are long-term gestation projects. So there's always a mismatch between the tenor of the funds that have been raised and the deployment of funds. But when you talk of pension and insurance funds, where people put their savings and they want returns on a long-term basis, so they also need projects which will continuously give them returns over a long period of say 20 to 30 years. And more importantly, in the US context, tax-free returns, because taxes is a major issue. And therefore, these revolving funds came out with instruments which were actually targeted for the requirement of these entities. Over the years, it has been established that these municipal funds, these municipal pooled bonds, actually, which they call as munis, have become the 4th largest market after mortgages, government securities, and corporate bonds. Of course, India is a different situation. We don't have a thriving bond market yet, whether it's corporate, government, or mortgages. But in the US situation, where traditionally financing has been done through debt, today the 4th largest is the municipal bond market. And as many as more than 87,500 local governments have actually been able to dip into this market and create assets to the tune of about $2.4 trillion till 2006. Now, at this point of time, I would like to share with you, based on this, what happened in India, particularly in a state like Tamil Nadu, where we actually established a financial intermediary, which is the first of its kind, called the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund. Yeah. Can I use this to go forward?
Yes.
Right. No, I think you'll have to go back to that one. Just go. Just go This is broadly the municipal administration system in Tamil Nadu. I won't dwell much on this, except for the fact that traditionally the government has had a very, very close control over the various local bodies in the urban sector, broadly which are the corporation, the municipalities and the Nagar Panchayats, we call them town panchayats. And this is the number of such local bodies. And what's interesting is that the function of water and sanitation has been handled by two separate parastatals, one for Chennai metropolitan region and one for the entire state. And they have two financial intermediaries. A lot of states don't even have one. Here there are two of them. One which is owned by the state, TUFIDCO, and one TNUDF, which is a public-private partnership, of which I was the CEO. This is just a snapshot, just to show that Tamil Nadu is possibly the most urbanized state in India today in terms of the percentage of population that resides in the urban areas. And the growth of urban population has been phenomenal over the past 2 decades. And as Dr. Ahluwalia had mentioned briefly in her presentation, urban areas contribute substantially to the GDP. In the case of the state of Tamil Nadu, about 70% is estimated to come from the urban sector. We have the flagship fund, which is called the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'll talk about a sister fund, which is the Water and Sanitation Pooled Fund, which was formed in the year 2002. It was registered as a trust owned fully by the government of Tamil Nadu, having a board of trustees which prescribed the policies and procedures. And this was designated as the state pooled finance entity under the newly launched Pooled Finance Development Fund scheme of the Government of India. And this particular entity actually successfully managed 2 bond issues. And interestingly, it is managed by this company called the Tamil Nadu Urban Infrastructure Financial Services Limited, which is the fund manager for not just the WSPF, but also the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Fund, both of which are PPP entities. The objective of this fund is basically to raise in a cost-effective manner resources from the capital market using the pooled finance structure, and to finance urban infrastructure projects using these funds. And more importantly, look at the viability of these projects and thereafter provide the project financing on a no profit and no loss basis. Just a quick view on pooled financing. Essentially what it talks about is that since individual local bodies are unable to access the market, so you pool the requirement of several of them and then come out with a bond issue which then raises debt from the capital market on their behalf, and for which a special purpose vehicle is created, just like the Water and Sanitation Pooled Fund. And this fund actually then gives the bond proceeds to finance the capital assets in these local bodies. The project revenues then from the local bodies flow back to meet the debt service requirements as well as the O&M of the projects. What is important is that the SPV, in this case the Water Sanitation Pooled Fund, is actually responsible to the bondholders for repayment and not the local body directly. Because the local body does not command much credibility in the eyes of the investors. Therefore, there is a need for an intermediary who has this credibility and the responsibility. All such bond issues would be rated, and then there are certain credit enhancements that are done in order to achieve a particular rating. In our case, it used to be typically AA rating, and these credit enhancements I'll come to in the next slide, and the guarantees actually help you go with a good rating and hence the lowest possible rate of interest in the market. And very critical to this is that there is an enormous amount of support which is given by the state and the central government, without which these structures cannot function. This is how it typically functions, a bit complicated, but I'll try to explain quickly. This is that pooled finance entity, the SPV. What it does is it actually issues bonds on behalf of these local bodies. And when it issues these bonds, the bond proceeds flow into the SPFE. This in turn provides the project finance to the local bodies. The local bodies actually construct and implement the projects with the help of the parastatals wherever necessary. Thereafter, when the project revenues start coming in, the cash flows are put into an escrow account at individual ULB level, and and these escrow amounts are actually taken as annuities to pay back to the pooled finance entity, which ultimately is responsible for the bond repayments. In order to strengthen this structure, there is a state finance devolution intercept facility, which means that under the State Finance Commission, there are certain monies that need to be periodically transferred to the local bodies. So these come straight from the state government, but these are intercepted and put it into the escrow account to the extent of default. So if a local body defaults in its project cash flows, then the SFC devolution actually kicks in and fulfills that gap. And then there are certain credit rating guarantees that are given in the nature of third-party guarantees by the states. The first bond issue actually had the USAID giving those kind of guarantees. The first issue came out in 2002. It was first of its kind in the country. It was basically to refinance an existing loan which the local bodies had taken at a huge rate of interest of 16%. The fund requirement of 13 ULBs was pooled and an issue size of 32 crores worked out. And the pool actually was able to raise money at 9.2% per annum, giving them a clear advantage of about 6.8% in terms of interest for 15 years. And I believe right now, still it is in the repayment phase. But what's interesting is that this credit enhancement was done by an escrowing of the property tax and other collections. The bond service fund, which was like an equity, was contributed by the state government. There was a USAID partial guarantee of 50% of the principal amount, and the interception of the state devolution was also built in. So all these were credit enhancement measures, which ultimately resulted in a credit rating of AA SO. SO is structured obligation. There was a saving of interest to the local bodies who prepaid this loan. And typically, who were the investors? They were provident fund trusts, gratuity funds, and banks who invested in these bonds. And interestingly, all these installments so far since 2002 have been promptly serviced. And more importantly, these bonds are being actively traded in the secondary market. These were the subscribers. As you can see, most of them were banks, some of them were provident funds. And as on date, this could be, I think, a bit dated, but when this presentation was made, there were about 28 bondholders, of which 26 were provident funds and gratuity trusts. These were the local bodies who actually availed of this pooled bond issue. And this is again another kind of diagrammatic representation of how these funds were flowing to the local bodies and how these escrow funds were created, how the bond service fund was there, and the third-party guarantee. Based on this experience and backed by other entities like the Karnataka counterpart of TNUDF, the Government of India came out with this wonderful scheme called the Pooled Finance Development Fund Scheme, where each state was encouraged to set up its own state pooled finance entity like TNUDF. And the guidelines were prescribed by Government of India, and it was aimed specifically at medium and small towns' capital requirements, because large towns were presumed to go to the market on their own steam. But then the small and medium towns were where they required this kind of pooling structure to help them access the market. The clear preference was for water and sanitation, because these were long-term, long-gestation projects. It said that the debt securities would be issued without a state guarantee. Now that's interesting. And there would be a credit rating, obviously, by a recognized agency. They had certain conditions, like the project should generate a debt service coverage ratio of about 1.25. And there was a dedicated fund that was set up to actually, it was capitalized by about 300 crores to provide the initial capital for this scheme. Under this scheme, about 95% of the funds were set apart for the CREF, which is the Credit Rating Enhancement Fund, which would go to the pooled finance entity, and 5% for project development. The CREF in turn was structured in such a manner that 50% of the requirement for the debt service fund would be met from the CREF, or 10% of the issue size. And the interest earned on this CREF, of course, was not tax-free, but could be used as an interest subvention tool. So these are broadly the details. I don't want to get into the details, but what's interesting here is that it also talked about reforms. That if any local body were to avail of this pooled financing option, they had to go in for certain accounting reforms, impose user charges, improve their collection efficiencies according to a set kind of a schedule in line with the JNNURM agenda. And of course, the local bodies had to get a buy-in from the councils. So we came out with the first tax-free pooled bonds under the Pooled Finance Development Fund scheme. And the maximum rate of interest that was prescribed by the Government of India was 8%. There was a ceiling, of course, on the project cost. The tenor was given a minimum of 5 years with a lock-in period. Now, a lot of these things were given by the scheme and not according to the market requirements. And there were, of course, certain other reforms that we brought in. The rest were all standard terms and conditions. The money had to be used within a period of 24 months, 85% of that, and could be listed on the stock exchange. This was, as I mentioned, the first of its kind, but because it was the first of its kind, there was a huge amount of, I should say, market building that was required to be done. We took 7 projects which were currently under implementation using funds of the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Project by the TNUDF. They had already been actually financed at 8.5%. So we were looking at a rate of interest less than this so that these could be again refinanced. The total cost of these 7 projects was 187 crores. And we wanted to go to market with the first tranche with about 90 crores to raise about 90 crores from the market in the first bond issue. The issue size of the first tranche, which was about 50% of the bond size, was about 45 crores. We were able to get a rating of AA, which is fairly good by Fitch. CREF required was worked out, which is about 22% of the issue size. The tenor of the bond was about 10 years, whereas the local bodies were allowed to repay over 20 years. And the TNUDF took upon itself the responsibility for managing the asset liability mismatch between this 10 and 20 years. And the regular credit enhancements were also built in. These were the local bodies and the funds that were distributed among them. So what was the outcome of this? I can go to the next one. This talks about the project development grant. I'll skip this because this basically takes care of the project development as well as the administration cost for actually issuing the bond issue, which is substantial money. The outcome was this. We went to market with a wish list of about 45 crores. The bond face value was 10 lakhs, so each bond was worth 10 lakhs. The subscription was only 6.70 crores. So if you ask me frankly, it was a failure, a partial failure, so to say. We were not able to raise the 45 crores that we went to market with. Tenure was 10-year, rating has been given. There were only 4 subscribers, of which 2 were high net worth individuals. The subscription period was kept open for about 40 days. We got 2 arrangers, the best in the market, who would also advise us. Despite their best of efforts, and that also with a commission, we were able to raise only 6.7 crores. But the coupon rate we got was extremely lucrative at 7.25%. And this was the arranger's fee. Why I'm saying this is that it's very important sometimes to learn from failures, to understand where did we go wrong, what's structurally wrong with these kind of instruments. It's very easy to say that we can go to the market and raise funds, but if you're not able to do it, what's wrong in it? This is just the time frame, just to show you that these kind of things take enormous amount of time. Now the first issue took about 18 months for the entire gamut of approvals and the preparation and the actual rollout to take place. And there was a huge amount of time it took to get the approval from the Government of India. Now this is one thing which a learning which we need to take. That unless you have flexibility, by the time you come with the approvals, the market is all changed. And this was the lesson that we learned. One, that there is a very limited market appetite for long-term tax-free municipal bonds, especially for tax-free entities like provident funds and mutual funds who already enjoy a tax-free status. So there's no point in taking to them tax-free municipal bonds. Water supply and underground sewerage projects need longer repayment periods. However, the market, which is a typical investor, looks at only 5 to 7 years. He wants to exit after that. The target investors are banks in the Indian context, insurance companies, and private companies. We didn't examine the retail option because of the huge transaction cost and because the market is very nascent. So it was a private placement. We went typically to banks and insurance companies and provident funds. The banks were affected by a particular section of the Income Tax Act. I can come to it later on if somebody wants to know the details, but they had huge issues around that. The taxable bonds, we still feel have a better potential in the Indian market than tax-free instruments. So any bond issue that needs to come to the market needs to address these concerns of the investor: safety, the liquidity, and the returns. Unfortunately, on most of these things, perhaps these bond issues which we came out with were not addressing their concerns. The approval process, as I mentioned, was extremely cumbersome. That needs to be looked into. And some amount of underwriting will have to be done in the initial market building phase. Certain Government of India directions may be required till the market matures. And the timing of the issue is also very, very critical because markets keep changing. Financial markets can't wait for policy responses. On the bank side, what are the policies that need to be taken to encourage these kind of bond markets? Banks need to be given liberty to invest in these bonds under the priority sector norms. Second, there is this issue of the Income Tax Act that needs to be resolved. Insurance companies, from their point of view, they are allowed to lend for social infrastructure, so this needs to be clearly classified as social infrastructure and recognize it under other approved securities. There is one particular clause. There are exempted trusts, provident funds and pension funds. For them, taxable bonds are much more attractive rather than tax-free bonds, so we need to come out with taxable bonds. Typically, they would be happier with a higher percentage of the debt service reserve fund, 30 to 50%. What Government of India proposed was quite less. And then the strengthening of the SPV, that particular pooled finance entity. It needs tax exemption for the interest earned on its corpus, and there needs to be some initial capitalization as well as investment in capacity building. Of course, there are other things like the approval process needs to be simplified, the norms for asset liability mismatch need to be redefined, and then possibly have a national level fund. And ma'am, this is one recommendation that I would personally like to make, that there are limitations in certain states, and you've gone to a lot of those states where they just don't have the capacity or the understanding to actually set up these complex financial intermediaries. So possibly for them have a national level entity which can help them, kind of raise funds from the market rather than rely on the states only to establish these pooled finance entities. I believe some toolkits have been developed by the Ministry of Urban Development. These can be now activated.
If you do that, then who takes the risk if the local body doesn't perform properly, let's say?
Yep.
Does the national government end up taking the risk?
No, see, you have to have a special purpose vehicle, and that special purpose vehicle could be co-financed by the state government and the central government. So it's that particular body which takes the risk, that SPV. So the shareholders will take the appropriate risk. You can work out the structuring as to who takes the equity in what percentage. Of course, there are other models. I don't want to spend much time on this. We worked on other structures which, if someone is interested, I can discuss and plan. We need to really ensure that the projects are actually financed at comfortable rates of interest. There's no point in saying that go to the market and raise market finance, because the market will charge you market interest. So there has to be also an understanding that a lot of your local bodies are not strong enough to handle that kind of market rates and the kind of expectations from the market. So there has to be some way by which you can subsidize that interest and allow for longer term loans for their projects. There cannot be a one-size-fits-all kind of a solution for local bodies. Everyone needs a different kind of a shoe. So what we are saying is that JNNURM should contemplate a similar structure by funding nodal agencies who may act. Now they have under the JNNURM what is called nodal agencies. Each state has its own nodal agency. What we require is that the state pooled finance entities at the state level should become the nodal agency for dovetailing the JNNURM funds. Rather than directly individually funding individual projects, it should be always routed through the pooled finance entity. And of course, there is a project development phase that nobody talks of. There's a huge amount of effort and manpower as well as money that is required to develop projects. Not much attention is being paid anywhere in the project development. You need a shelf of projects, and then these these projects have a shelf life of their own. You create a project at substantial expense, but if you don't finance them, they lose their shelf life. So therefore, continuously some agency has to keep coming out with projects, structuring them, and take into account the fact that there are bound to be procurement delays, there are several risks down the line. So unless you have a specialized agency to do that, leaving it to the local bodies to just do project development and keep waiting for finance is not going to be workable. So the general recommendation that we came out with was that JNNURM has to relook at the business as usual model. And it's an appropriate time because now that the High Power Committee is getting into this, we would rather say that rather than use all your money into schemes like UIDSSMT with a very, very high grant component of 90 to 100%, leverage these funds. Leverage these funds to get the capital markets to kick in finance, debt finance to projects. There's a huge amount of money out there in the financial markets, the retail and the institutional investors. Let's try to tap those funds as they do it in the United States and other countries, rather than use precious JNNURM money to finance projects.
Will this come for small and medium towns?
Yes, ma'am. Actually, the pooled financing ideally works for small and medium towns, because it's not a small town.
You leverage the money for the pool financing.
For pooled financing, actually designed for the small and medium towns. The comparative advantages of debt financing, I want to mention this. See, when you go for a debt financing, you need to do a rigorous kind of a structure of the project, which means you need to do project development, you need to structure it properly as to how much debt, how much equity, rate of interest, what is going to be the cash flows, what is my IRR, what is my debt service coverage ratio. Unless you do that, you cannot go to the market. So that rigor comes in. That's the first and foremost advantage of debt financing, which doesn't happen in the case of grant-based projects. Second, you develop inherently an incentive to maintain the projects. This is what ma'am mentioned in the beginning. A lot of these projects you visited, ma'am, you would have seen they would have been built 5-10 years ago. But what's their status? If you do an audit, a quick check of the projects that have been done, and I've seen plenty of them in my state here, assets have been built, but they are not being put to optimal use. They're not generating revenues, because there is no incentive for the local body to actually maintain them. The incentive comes only when they have to repay, because I have to repay, so I have to maintain the asset. I have to maintain that asset because I want project cash flows to come in to repay my debt. So unless you bring in those right incentives, economic incentives, unless they are brought in, there's no point in keeping on pumping money into projects, because what you're going to create are only white elephants which will not yield any returns. And finally, you have to bring in the stake of the ULBs. They must see it as their projects, something in which their money has been put, not somebody else's. And therefore, to address your question, is essentially pooling is a tool for the weaker ULBs or the small and medium towns which on their own don't have the credibility to go to the market. And rather than just using these UIDSSMT resources thinly, and that's what's happened. If you see the JNNURM, the number of projects that have been done, about 1,000 odd projects across the country, I mean, they are virtually spread it too thin, and maybe picked and chosen 1 or 2 projects in some town here and there, without any rationale as to what was the basis. Just because 90%, 100% grant was available, projects have been selected, but what happened to those projects? Have they actually resulted in improving the financial capability of these local bodies? Have they improved the service level delivery? We are not sure of that. And again, what should be the debt grant mix? JNNURM also contemplates that you needn't pass on all these grants as grants. You could always mix them up as loan and grant. But then what is the optimum mix that you need to give? According to us, it should be according to a local body, its ability to raise finance, its ability to repay the loan, as well as the project per se. What are its returns? Every project has to have a different debt grant mix. You cannot have a one-size-fits-all kind of a solution, which has been typically the vein of government projects. And then you should have a special dispensation for what are called hardship communities. There are poor people who need to be given special dispensation. There are local bodies which are not rich enough. So we need to provide them with more liberal structures which will address these kind of communities based on some rational criteria like median incomes. And what happens typically in all these cases is once you don't stop with a pool bond issue. For a pool bond issue, you have a debt service requirement, a debt service reserve fund, which is typically say about 20% of the pool size. But as and when repayments happen, this portion keeps getting liquidated, which you can again use for strengthening the further pool bond issues. So you actually create a stream of bond issues, and over a period of time, you develop your own equity to such a level that at some point of time, you don't require any state support. A. Secondly, you actually improve your own rating to maybe AAA. So these are things which on a long-term basis can help to sustain this whole program. And therefore, to summarize, what we would like to say is that you need to actually revisit this whole concept of how projects have been financed, especially in the urban sector. You need to shift from the grant-based mode to a debt-financed funding of urban projects. These grants, as and when they are given, should be given strictly on need basis and not on a uniform basis that, okay, all these projects will be eligible for 50% grant or 80% grant. No, it has to be according to need. Government funds, and this is the most critical part of my presentation, these should be leveraged. The word should be leveraging. You've got enough funds in the domestic market to tap. I don't need to even go to international donors. There's enough money thanks to our growth in our economy to tap the domestic financial markets. But please, for heaven's sake, we should use to the maximum our government funds, which should be used to leverage these from the financial markets. The market for pooled and municipal bonds will not just happen if you just create SPFEs or create these beautiful instruments. You actively need to develop a market. There are ways of developing these markets. You need initially some support from the states, from the central government. You need to have flexibility to allow, let's say, taxable bonds. You need to have flexibility in terms of the coupon rate and so on. Then, most importantly, the investors, they are the market. They have certain concerns, as I mentioned. You have to talk to them, find out what are their concerns, and tailor make the scheme according to their requirements, not based on some prejudged assumptions of the market. The local bodies at the same time have a need for long-term low-cost capital, and this has to be recognized very clearly. There's no point in saying that they have to go to market and raise funds at market rates. This won't happen. But therefore, the initial support from the government, both at the center and the states, is critical for kickstarting this whole market for the pooled bonds. I think we can just go back to this slide and just.
Can I ask you one
Yes.
question? You know, this one big idea of the Minister for Urban Development that he wants to, instead of giving grants, he wants to have loan to grant, depending on whether the UAB has done a good job. So make this an incentive that in the first instance you get a loan, but if you get things done within certain parameters. Does that fit into your scheme of what the way you're presenting? Is there any scope for that?
Actually, it's a new idea, ma'am. It's not been tried, but we can work out a structure. I'm happy at least the minister is talking about debt financing. Some time ago, you couldn't talk about this to any such functionary because they think debt is anathema. The belief is that government is my baap, it should be only giving and not be acting like a money lender. So first, I'm very happy that now that thinking has come, at least at the political executive level, that yes, you have to give loans which are meant to be repaid. Now what you're saying is, to incentivize somebody to repay in time, you need to give him some discounts. So what he's saying is that we convert it into grants. It's another way of saying that I'll give you a discount. Now that discount, what he's saying is instead of giving a discount on the interest, I'm going to give a discount on the entire capital or something. So we could work out a structure where you have some graded kind of incentive structure which allows people to actually repay the loan. We could have a scheme where we could say that initially we will allow anybody who repays, some kind of a discount on the interest rate, or maybe you could say a deferment of their this thing. Maybe the last installments I won't take it from. It's all those kind of marketing techniques that typically a lot of these lending agencies do, and they do it all the time. Government wants to do it by all means. It's government's money, but principally they must accept the fact that the local body must be made clear that money is not free. There is a cost to it, and it's their responsibility to pay back that money. And if they can only pay back only if they create assets that generate revenues, or assets that help them to improve their income. So we can work with the ministry on this one. It's a very good idea, but I'm really very happy to know that at least the thought process has shifted from grant to actually debt.
Would there be an issue of bad debts? How would that get covered? Because if you see these standard banks which give to SMEs and these whoever it is, you have a huge bad debt which gets written off over a period of time.
You're talking about our experience? Or
Yeah, like this. You know, if you have, like what she was suggesting, if the government is looking at giving.
Actually, ma'am, to just give an example, when I left TNUDF, there were nearly 1,000 crores worth of assets on our books. 1,000 crore worth of assets we had created. The repayment was 100%. Not a single case of default. And I presume maybe since I left, the situation has continued, but not a single case of a default from local bodies which are traditionally believed to be very poor, you know, repayment records and all. So I think we need to understand why defaults happen. At the same time, I mentioned there is another agency called TUFIDCO, and that's a state government entity. Their record is not as good. I believe they live with a huge default rate of nearly 30% on their outstandings. But we had a 0%.
Yeah, actually, I think your idea of sort of leveraging government funds that are available is really powerful, because private capital can come in a big way, but some essential pieces of sort of market infrastructure are required. So, for instance, if you do a pure credit rating assessment of these urban local bodies, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but my guess is that they would end up in the lower end of the rating bucket, maybe anywhere between single B to triple B. And the capital markets for these ratings are not very well developed. However, there is this concept of sort of market worthiness that is, that I think is very interesting, which is to say that even though two urban local bodies from a credit rating perspective, which largely looks at financials, might be the same, the market worthiness might be very different. Their capacity to implement projects might be very different, in which is a very important driver of the default rates in these types of projects. So if we could, perhaps think of a way to, pull in one of the mainstream rating agencies to drive this market worthiness agenda, then that could really drive, capital markets access. And also another thought that I had was that, given that, the interest rate environment is sort of variable and sometimes single digit funds, may not be available, given where interest rates are, let's say at the moment, then why not also use the government funds to, make up the differential rather than say let's not do funding at all.
No, I'm not coming to that. I'll just close my presentation with a few more slides which will address your question exactly. Maybe I'll take that question at that point of time. Can we just go back to, so I'll just, I've already talked about, the benefits of pooled bonds. And this is the paradigm shift I was talking about. Now coming directly to the JNNURM. As I said, consciously now JNNURM in its new avatar needs to talk about leveraging. And I'm not saying that entire funds need to be now leveraged. You just see the structure that I'm coming to. We need to have need-based grants for weaker ULBs or poor communities. We need to simultaneously work on the municipal bond market and engage with all the stakeholders, particularly investors, based on the experience so far. In fact, that experience I didn't mention. I dropped out of TNUDF after 2 years after I left. Again, they went to market, and in the first shot, they were able to raise the balance money. So the 45 crore, I raised about 6 crore. The balance went to like anything, and I believe they are coming out with a second. So market changed in 2 years. In my time, the market was not ready for that instrument. But when we went to Government of India, they said, no, you first try it out based on our guidelines. Then we'll see. With that experience, we'll learn. We gave certain suggestions, they never agreed. After 2 years, the market changed. There was an appetite for those kind of things. There were some high net worth individuals who actually picked up. The entire thing, 45 crores, sailed through. So markets will keep on changing. So a fundamental thing is go with the market, go with the investor. What do they want? And I'll just come to the recommendations I've already. This is the structure that a possibility could be examined in terms of the JNE. I'll just take 2 minutes to explain this. Let's say I have a project worth 100 rupees. Traditionally, how would it work in a small and medium town under JNNERM? That 90 rupees would come from the JNNERM or even 100 rupees. Balance would be left to the local body to bear. What we are suggesting is that instead of that, okay, let's have the same thing where the ULB brings in its 10 rupees, but 90 rupees shouldn't come in as grant from the government. What the government should do, in this case the Government of India, you have this special purpose vehicle, the State Pooled Finance Entity. The Government of India gives only 10 bucks and the state gives a matching share of 10 rupees. This could be, of course, flipped around, you could say 15.5 or 20.0, I don't know. But let's say only 20 rupees is given by both entities. And this entity then goes to the market and raises 70 rupees against this. So this 20 rupees actually acts as a debt service reserve fund, say the DSRF. This remains as equity in the bond issue and says to the bondholder that your money, in case there is a default, I dip it to this 20 rupees and pay you. But primarily they will be repaid from the project cash flows. But in case of a default, this debt service reserve fund is there to help you in case of a need. So 70 rupees in that project will actually come from the external market. And this 70 rupees goes into the project. So 70 comes from the bondholder. This 20 doesn't go anywhere. It remains in the SPV as the equity, just in case of a default. And that is where the government's money goes. So government's money doesn't go to the project. It goes only as the equity to this. Whereas the project money is actually financed from the bondholder plus the ULB. So 70 plus 10, 80. The balance 20, what we are saying is, can come by way of a direct grant to the project. So what we are giving right now is about 80 to 90 rupees. We will reduce it to about 20 rupees. So Government of India sets up a separate grant fund, which is again managed by the same fund manager. So this gives 20. Now I'm saying 20 cannot be a uniform one size fits all. It could be based on project to project. Some project may not require any 20 rupees at all. It could be 0. It could be maybe going up to 30 or 40 or 50. But just a structure to show that most of the project financing is done through debt. It could be 70, it could be 60, 80. I mean, it could be depending on the project. But broadly, let's say 70 rupees comes from the debt, 20 from the grant, and 10 from the local body. This is a possible approach. And this successfully has been implemented by us under the successive 3 projects, the Tamil Nadu Urban Development Project of the World Bank. It's extremely successful. And all the TNUDFs, 1,000 crore odd disbursements have been done under this model. Works beautifully well, 0 default. So this is the structure. The State Pooled Finance Entity forms a trust. It's a trust actually in joint venture of Government of India with FIs. I believe FIs like IDFC or IIFCL can set up under their mandate a JV along with the state government. So we could have that state entity which is actually a joint venture with the central government, the state government, the financial institutions, where the majority share is held by the government institutions. So it becomes a government-owned, a public sector fund, so to say. However, for managing this SPV, there is a fund manager company where the same partners come in as equity holders. However, here the states, the Government of India and state have a minority equity stake. Why we do it in Tamil Nadu here is because then it gives us the character of a private company. When you are a private company, there are obviously advantages. You can get the best of manpower from the market, you can pay them market salaries, you have flexibility in terms of procurement, you have flexibility which a state entity doesn't have. And maybe that is one reason why we've been having a good track record compared to the state. And lots of states have these entities at the state level, but they are all public sector owned and run by the public sector, which means there are certain inherent deficiencies which the success of TNUDF primarily is because the fund manager is an entity that is having majority stake by the private sector. So you have domain specialists you can draw from the market, but what they have very intelligently done is that the CO has been drawn from the state government. So guys like me, who are actually, government servants, we actually come and sit there. I used to be the only government guy there. The rest of the people were all private sector experts. And the advantage is an officer from the state government helps in coordination. So when he is there and he talks to local bodies, they listen to him. He is able to liaise better with the state entities. So this was very interesting model that worked well in Tamil Nadu, and we requested that this should be considered seriously by all states. But this is something which we couldn't do, which I would recommend that JNNURM should stipulate. We were not the state nodal agency. The JNNURM funds never used to come through us. It used to come through the state entity, that FIDCO. But there is no need to have two entities. You could have just one entity. The state pooled finance entity should be de facto the nodal agency under JNNURM, so that the funds are routed through them. And as I mentioned, these JNNURM funds should be used partly as grant and partly as equity or a junior debt to raise external finance on a sustainable basis. So you have a debt service reserve fund, which is a collateral, and the size of this fund should be based on the credit rating requirements and not based on any assumptions that I'll give only 20% or 10%. Some of the requirements, the credit rating agencies may want 30% or 40%. In USA, in some cases, they even have 50% as the debt service requirement. So according to the market, according to the rating agency requirements, we need to have this DSRF, and the interest earnings on this could be used to actually reduce the cost of the local bodies. So if I'm borrowing from the market at 12%, I can actually maybe earn 3% interest on my DSRF and actually use it to give the benefit to local body who gets at 9% or 8%. So that's the whole idea. And of course, what we say is that these pooled bonds could be taxable or tax-free. The coupon rate should be pegged to the market rate, tenor according to the appetite of the investors, and there has to be a mismatch of asset liability that has to be managed through the equity of the SPFE. And these are the various credit enhancement measures which I talked about earlier. I won't repeat this. And the challenges are, one, as in the case of the United States, I think that the time has come to actually give it legal status. There's no point in just talking about guidelines which are never followed by any state. They did it through the state environmental acts. The Clean Water Act and the Drinking Water Act were actually legislations which actually enabled to set up these revolving funds. There is a legal sanctity to it. No government can come and simply just kind of dissolve these pooled finance entities. You're going to stay there for 20 years, 30 years. You're going to be handling assets worth thousands of crores. What is the confidence the market gets? Unless you have a legal sanction to it, nobody's going to come and invest money, because you never know. There's a government which comes and simply dissolves this whole thing. So therefore, there is a need perhaps for a law that actually gives legal sanctity to these funds. More importantly, as in the case of the US, it also helps to trigger a demand. What they did was, there was this act which said that you have to clean up your waterways, you have to clean up your drinking water. Today, as you mentioned, ma'am, about the solid waste management, that's the only rules we had till 2000. Now only they have come out with some other. But today, let's say if you make it mandatory that every local body has to have those service levels which you talked of, 100% sewerage coverage, 100% safe drinking water at 135 LPCD or whatever. From an environmental point of view, even if you were to issue these kind, instantly, ma'am, the solid waste handling rules were issued by the E&F ministry, not by the housing government. So it was the first environmental legislation and not a municipal legislation. Similar to that, why can't we have for the wastewater, for drinking water? Make it mandatory that every local body has to comply it within time frame. Then that demand will be triggered. Once the demand is triggered, they'll go to you and say, get me funds. And if you say, look, I can give you funds only on a debt mode, they have no other go but to come to JNNURM for debt. Today that demand is not there. Even if I don't clean up my waterways, I don't treat my wastewater, there's no penalties on me. And the state pollution control boards, you know how they are functioning, so the less said the better. Therefore, one is a law. Second, suitable program structure has to be worked out, which is credible, which can be accepted by all the states, the way we did it in Tamil Nadu. Third, the implementation toolkits need, of course, some of them have already been worked out under the PFDF. We need standardized documents, a loan tracking and a customer support system. These can all be worked out. Capacity building, we've talked about a lot. It's happening, but maybe not fast enough. But what's important, ma'am, that we need to build a new breed of city managers. And I think some work is being done on that. We have here some colleagues here, I mean, we've been talking about all that. But these are the guys who are supposed to be managers of tomorrow, the CEOs of these cities, who should be having the capacity to do project financing, understand what finance is all about, what let's say procurement is. They should be aware of the latest in, let's say, e-governance, people who know everything about accounting. So it's a completely new skill sets we are talking of. And unless we create this, it will be very difficult to run such a massive program as your committee has recommended. And of course, we need to have separate grant funds and project development funds, which may be handled by the same intermediary. Finally, see, I just want to, I wanted to mention this, in this whole report, we also talked of using public-private partnerships to actually finance some of these small and medium towns. I'm a great proponent, I must say, of PPPs. We've been working, Ashwin and some of the people in this room, we've all been working on PPP projects, how to make them workable. Not much success, though, in a lot of the states. But I just want to put on the board, there are much more qualified people than me who can talk about this. But in my humble view, ma'am, if you look at PPPs for financing small and medium towns, at the moment the prognosis is very bleak. I'm not confident today that given our current level of commitment to public-private partnerships, given our capacity constraints, this is going to mature in the short run. Why? Because one, there is no clear law or policy at state level, except for Gujarat or maybe one or two states. None of the states have, forget about the law, not even a policy. And despite the fact that they have actually been doing PPP projects, Tamil Nadu has been doing a lot of PPP projects, but we don't have a policy. It's all one-off and ad hoc. So without a clear legislation, a policy, you will not be able to get PPP funding into our projects. And I believe a lot of our, funding is supposed to come from the private sector as per the report. Then there are capacity constraints, which a lot has been already spoken about. And people don't even understand what these P's stand for. Forget about how they will structure these projects and run them. Then the unwillingness on the part of the government, the ULBs to share risk. Risk sharing is the most critical success factor of any PPP. If you're not willing to trust the other guy and share the risk, there's no point in talking about it. And incidentally, I just want to mention one thing. In the report, it's mentioned that a lot of these projects like water and wastewater projects or solid waste should be given to the PPP sector. Whatever we've studied about PPPs and the discussions we've had so far, a lot of consensus is there that it's a bad idea to actually put PPP projects, PPP arrangements in complex projects like wastewater treatment or solid waste management. Actually, PPPs should be done in projects which are routine in nature. For example, building a road or building a drain is a no-brainer. Actually, PPPs should be done there because it has, the private operator has the confidence that it can be done, the risks are low. The moment you ask him to do a complex project where risks are huge and you put all the risk on him, these projects will be very difficult to structure and govern. So therefore, maybe Ashwin can throw some more light on this later, but it is my belief that we shouldn't kind of believe that PPPs can be given to, for those projects which I can't do, which I can't handle. And the fundamental thing that using PPPs to, the rationale for PPPs, which is that you're using it to actually fund projects, is again subject to debate. Because we believe that there are other advantages of PPPs, especially like efficiency arguments and other arguments, which should be the basis for PPP. You shouldn't be using PPP just to fill that gap, as if these are meant to bring funds into the projects. So therefore, there have been these constraints because of which so far PPPs have not really taken off the way we wanted to do them. However, the state pooled finance entity, in our case the TNUDF, actually was a huge advocate for PPPs. And we used to typically promote them through advocacy, through technical support. A lot of local bodies we used to support. Somebody comes and say, hey, I want to do street lighting. on a PPP mode. Can you help me? I don't know how to even write a contract. I don't know how to bid it. I don't know how to shortlist people. So we actually used to write those documents for them, actually help them with the entire procurement process. So this technical support can be given again by this entity. And then financing. Why can't we finance, for example, the private operator? The guy who does your wastewater treatment plant or your streetlight maintenance operator, I can actually finance him out of this particular fund. So it's my view, maybe in the near future, although I would love to, but then I don't feel very optimistic that the PPP route may yield much success, especially at the small and medium town level. Possibly at big city level, yes, they have the capacity, they have the ability, they could do something. But for creating infrastructure, I don't think we should kind of put so much. And finally, on this issue about sustaining debt, despite all our projections about how much we can raise in terms of property taxes, other sources of revenue, the transfers and all that, I still feel there's a huge amount of risk. For sustaining debt, you cannot live with risk. You need to have very clear cash flows. You need to have clear understanding as to how this debt will be financed. Otherwise, nobody is going to invest in it. But one area which I think we also mentioned in your presentation briefly is land. A lot of local bodies have not truly actually utilized this potential tool for actually raising finance which can help to service debt. And I'm not talking of selling family silver. Most of the local bodies don't have lands that they can sell or they can monetize. What we are saying is use land, especially land planning, land use planning I would say, as well as typical town planning tools to actually unlock this value of land. A lot has been said about betterment levies and the town planning scheme. I won't go into the details. But these land-based instruments, I feel, are a potential way of actually servicing debt. So I'm still saying debt should be a principal mode of financing, apart from your own revenue and other statutory transfers. But to sustain this debt, just user fee alone will not be able to sustain debt. In fact, I've done some studies at my own level across several local bodies in Tamil Nadu. The actually debt sustaining capacity of most of the local bodies at current revenues is hardly about 10%. In the best case scenarios, it may go to 15%. Beyond that, they cannot take debt. So if you really want them to raise debt to the extent that I was mentioning in my presentation, you have to use land as an instrument. And that can be done only if town planning functions are given to the local bodies, that they have control on the land use, so that they can effectively then use these instruments, as has been successfully done in Gujarat and in some other states, to actually unlock the value of land and then use it to monetize the capital flows. And finally, ma'am, the city development plans that have been made so far under JNNURM, I've been always saying that these are all grant driven. Just because I want a particular project in my local body, to fulfill that tick box, I get some consultant to prepare a CDP. I have seen more than enough CDPs to come to the conclusion that most of these CDPs are only worth the paper they are written on. I'm very frank about it. None of them have any basis with the actual, the financial needs or the financial possibilities of any local body. Therefore, these CDPs actually need to become live documents which can be implemented. They need to flow from master plans. Every city needs to have a master plan based on which you have a development plan. And these need to be based on land as an instrument for actually generating finance. So unless you integrate the land function, the planning function with the development function, there is no point in just talking about the CDP with saying, this is the deficiency, this is my capital requirement, this is my source of finance, and hence this is my plan. They are simply financial plans, that's all. But a city development plan is something more than just a financial plan. It has to integrate the land use, and for that, how you plug in that into the financing possibilities. So these CDPs need to be re-looked at. And then, as has been talked in your report, that these need to talk to each other. Very often, there are certain economies of scale when 2 or 3 cities share infrastructure or share costs. And unless these are integrated on the regional level, very difficult for an individual small and medium town to actually work out a credible development plan. So these need to talk to each other and come out with regional plans that optimize the land use for driving economic activity and common infrastructure. summary. I'll stop at this. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
I was just concerned about a couple of issues relating to the local bodies and the problem of free ridership and moral hazard that might arise. When you're talking about 30-year debt obligation and things like that, how do you sort of deal with those issues, and what sorts of changes need to be introduced institutionally to sort of ensure that these problems don't arise?
Yeah, then there's always this question that a politician has only a 5-year time span, and why should he contract a debt? And if he does it, maybe that moral hazard issue is there, kind of leaving a debt for the future. But this is where typically the role of a financial intermediary comes in. A financial intermediary is typically expected to be objective in its assessment of a project. One of the reasons why we were able to ensure a high degree of compliance with the repayment was because we knew that there will be certain local bodies who will be committing this kind of a moral hazard. So you look at the project and see whether it's actually viable before you commit your funds to it. So this is one check, that you ensure that they are not profligate and they don't come to you with a huge basket of wish list and just impose a debt burden on their local body, which for the next 30 years nobody is able to repay. So the financial intermediary has to exercise its due diligence and ensure. Then secondly, there have to be certain safety measures that have to be built in terms of how the project is structured. So as to ensure that, in fact, if you ask me, this problem is much more compounded if you were to just kind of allow free run. Somebody says, I need this much to build this thing and all, because he is just pocketing some part of it and maybe perhaps getting away with it. But the moment you say, I need you to repay this, and I'll be watching the progress of the project and then the repayments, it's difficult for them to kind of pose such kind of request for debt unless they have kind of been able to satisfy you on those regards. The other thing which I just wanted to bring to your notice is that the same kind of issues also happen at the central and state level. Very often you find governments borrowing beyond their means to finance certain projects. Same issues will also come up there. Why do we believe that local bodies are the only guys who will be subject to these kind of moral hazard issues or the free ridership that you talked of? To me, people are the same everywhere. It's only a level below this way.
Also, if you're saying the funding from the government will be leveraged with money from the capital markets, there'll be an additional level of assessment which is totally objective, and where the interest will be to maximize returns while not losing money, and things like sort of market worthiness standards. If they were to come from the mainstream rating agencies, it would allow the capital markets players to distinguish between one urban local body and another.
Can I give you one interesting insight?
Yeah.
Very often we used to have chairmen of municipal bodies come to us with an outlandish request for some project financing, which would not even allow it to just want to throw it out of the window. And this gentleman would come and say, I know you will not sanction this, but I want you to say that, because I am not able to say that to my councillors. So my chaps, they are putting pressure on me to do this, but the moment you reject it, I say, I have got nothing to do with it. The funding agency is with you. So those checks and balances are very necessary. And second, see, they are all people from the grassroots. They live there. People in central government and all don't even live there. What they are financing in Tamil Nadu, nobody knows in Delhi what's happening. Those guys have to live, they have to answer the public. They are representatives of the public, they have to live with them. They cannot get away with it. It's not a question of that 5 years alone. After that 5 years, where will he go? They will live there only. So I think people in the local bodies are far more responsible, if you ask me, than what we give them public.
I have a question. Your last point is talking about you have to have a regional outlook. government side, all the towns are not uniform in terms of political administration. Then is the problem, how to look at the aspects where every towns can come together in the region and work for it.
I know that political economy is always there,
Yeah.
but it's not come in the way. We've also seen, in fact, very often in projects like solid waste management, in street lighting, maybe project I think we did on water supply also. We had clusters of towns. In fact, clusters were as big as 25 or 20 towns, and very often of different political dispensation and worked well. Because at that level, I think the local pressures are far more stronger than these kind of political issues. And especially when you talk of, I mentioned about like solid waste management, they know that it's beyond them to actually build landfills, for example, at their level. They have to cooperate. There's no other road. So I don't think these political questions really come in the way. At local body level, things are far better. We've done that.
You had a slide where you had these 18 municipalities with the first one, and you had this, how much money was supposed to be given to them and how much money was actually used. Could you just go back to that slide again? I didn't have a chance to look at it, but.
This other presentation, this one.
It seems to me
Yes.
that, okay, so for instance, something like Anagaputtur, which has really utilized very little, but still the risk is with you because you raised the amount from the market. So it looks like while structuring this fund is relatively straightforward, when you administer it, you have to effectively be capacity building for the urban local body in terms of helping them identify projects, helping them maybe design those projects, etc. So it seems a far more serious undertaking than just fund or an asset management kind of thing.
No, I agree with you on this. I can see this exercise has to go on parallelly. This particular was the first issue that came out, 50 crores or so, and most of it was for closing those existing loans, which they had taken at a high rate of interest. But by the time the bond was floated and the money would be disbursed to them, some of them had actually prepaid some of their loans. Some of them required more than what they had spent. Like this, take an Alandur. They actually ended up taking more than what we had envisaged because they did some more works, there were cost escalations and all. So they, within that overall ceiling, they made some adjustments to ensure, and then they had to see the debt repayment also capability. That Anagaputtur is a very weak municipality. So they said, fine, we initially posed this 178 lakhs, but now we feel that you may not have the ability to do it. But this thing came out because, in an anxiety to be first off the block, the PNUDF actually came out and rolled out a document. But then later on when they started disbursing, they found there were issues, with regard to repayment and the need. So then these amounts were then tinkered around with. But all along the investors were kept in the loop. So how the funds actually get deployed are contained in the detailed memorandum, which is actually shared with the. So every time there is a disclosure document, which has to go to the intermediaries and then to the investors. So they must know that initially I had asked you 178 for Anagaputtur, but I gave only 18. Balance I gave to whom? So they know where the funds have actually been deployed and for what reason. So unless you do a disclosure, very difficult to actually survive in the market. Unless you are transparent, unless you are having the disclosure, you cannot come out with the next bond issue. Thank you.